Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Happy New Year. In our case, that year is 1774. We're in 1774 terms, so the 18th of January was just 9 days before Mozart would turn 18. So this is our 10th year of Mozart 250, and we're starting to get into the seriously grown-up stuff. Mozart spent the whole of 1774 until the 5th or 6th of December at home in Salzburg, which was the first time he'd spent that long at home since he was 5. He'd been off all over Europe multiple times. And the main reason for that, well, there were two main reasons. One was that his employer and his father's employer, the Archbishop of Salzburg, was very keen that the Mozarts should do their job in Salzburg. His predecessor had been very keen for the family to tour, had recognized the benefits to Salzburg of having these amazing children. Of course, Mozart's sister was equally prodigious, traveling the whole of Europe and being showcased as a product of Salzburg. But the new archbishop had a very different view and resented the success that the Mozarts enjoyed outside Salzburg. So Mozart basically spent from early 1773 right to the end of the decade a few trips away, certainly towards the end. Obviously, he went to Paris and Mannheim, but most of the decade was at home in Salzburg, feeling increasingly frustrated. It always makes me laugh that Salzburg now has this amazing tourist industry based around their favourite son. And Mozart himself, of course, hated the place and felt it was some cultural backwater. One important thing that had happened to him the previous year, he and his father had taken themselves off to Vienna when the Archbishop was away, so they had 2.5 months leave, and they decided to go to Vienna. And the underlying reason for that is that Mozart's father was still on the lookout for finding some prestigious employment for Wolfgang that would enable potentially the whole family to up sticks and move away from Salzburg. They spent 2.5 months in Vienna. Nothing came of it, and when they got back to Salzburg, it seems that finally, after years of trying, Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father, accepted that they were going to just have to stay in Salzburg. So one of the very first things they did was to buy a bigger house in Salzburg so that there was room for them to be able to sleep in separate beds and not be packed together like sardines, which they had been up until that point. That trip to Vienna, however, was very important in a very nebulous way. It seems very likely that during those 2.5 months, Mozart would have come into contact for the first time with what Haydn had been writing recently, which was basically the symphonies in the 40s by Haydn, so the Farewell Symphony, the Trauer Symphony, a real sort of purple patch of Haydn symphonies. And also, equally importantly, Haydn's set of Opus 20 string quartets, which immediately made Mozart himself want to write string quartets. And what's interesting in our chronological Mozart 250 journey is that having been performing all this music in sort of real time over the last 10 years, it suddenly seems to me certainly quite palpable that the quality of his symphonies in particular, of which he wrote half a dozen in 1773 and 1774 as well, suddenly seems to be on a noticeably more consistent and higher level. And that, I think, has to be down to the influence of Haydn. This then is the 10th of these January concerts that we've given where we present a sort of top of the pops of the particular year in question 250 years previously. This is actually possibly the first year that Haydn's music hasn't featured, but his shadow still casts quite a spell, including in the first piece that we're performing tonight. We're back here at the beginning of May, the 2nd of May, with a program that is much more focused on what Mozart himself was up to in 1774. So we have two of his symphonies, numbers 28 and 30, his bassoon concerto, one of his epistle sonatas, and some vocal music as well. So tonight, we do have some fairly choice Mozart, but in the context of everything else that was going on around him. Not all the music that we feature in Mozart 250 is music that Mozart would have known, and I think that's important. There are sort of three types of music. There's, retrospectively, there's the music that Mozart wrote, the music that influenced him, that he heard and he was familiar with and was inspired by, and then there's music that he probably never heard, but was still absolutely part of the musical fabric of the time, and therefore had a sort of invisible influence in a way, because inevitably composers there's a sort of knock-on effect, and someone hears something and borrows it and then travels, and then that passes across the whole of Europe. There's one nice little piece of symmetry in tonight's concert. I've set myself, during the course of our 27-year journey, which we hope it will be, of Mozart 250, I've set myself the almost impossible challenge, but I haven't quite done the maths, but it might or might not be achievable. The target of featuring 100 composers of contemporaries of Mozart. And that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? It sounds like surely there aren't. We're featuring two composers who we haven't featured previously in the series tonight. And actually, I meant to go through all the programs before today, so I could tell you exactly. But certainly to the nearest two or three, these two composers are something like numbers 46 and 47. So we're nearly halfway to that target of 100. And through this very nice symmetry, the two composers are Pasquale Anfossi, an Italian writer of operas, and Anton Zimmermann, who principally wrote instrumental music. So tonight, for the first time within Mozart 250, we have a genuine A to Z, from Anfossi to Zimmermann. We begin, strangely, with the Z, with Zimmermann. He was a Silesian composer, so he was born and brought up in what's now the East Czech Republic. He was a very late starter as a composer, and of course he's so obscure that we don't actually know very much about him. We know that probably in his teens he went to Naples, where he studied in the famous conservatoire in Naples, where a lot of the great opera composers studied. He then got a job as a sort of itinerant violinist playing in the opera pits. Well, I guess they didn't really have pits in those days, but playing in the orchestra in front of the stage in numerous theatres in Naples. And it wasn't until he was in his 30s, probably through having played lots of very bad operas himself as a violinist, he decided that he was quite interested in starting to write operas himself. So he wrote operas during the sort of late 1760s, early 70s. He was born in 1741, so what's that, 15 years older than Mozart. Like Mozart, he died young. He died before he turned 40. And another quite nice symmetrical thing that I only noticed about 5 minutes ago, according to the latest count, and of course it's almost impossible to know these things, but the latest count is that there are 41 surviving symphonies by Zimmermann. It may well go up or down as research and scholarship develops. But it's rather wonderful that Mozart's last symphony was number 41. But we now know that Mozart wrote quite a few more than 41 symphonies, and the numbering system was established in the 1860s, and quite a lot of other works have come to light. And then there are other works that they were sort of adapted from serenades into symphonies, so do they count as a symphony or not? So if anyone ever asks you who wrote 41 symphonies, I would suggest that Zimmermann is a slightly better answer than Mozart. We are performing tonight a symphony in E minor that he wrote. One of the hazards, because we're so clearly limiting ourselves within Mozart 250 to doing everything year by year. With a lot of the instrumental music, there's not actually necessarily proof of exactly when a piece was written. With the operas, it's quite straightforward, because normally there's very clear records of the opera house and the date that an opera was premiered. But in symphonic music and instrumental music, often all we have is dates of publication, and sometimes pieces weren't published at all. So with this particular Zimmermann symphony, we know that it was published in 1774. So therefore, it was composed by 1774. Some of the J.C. Bach symphonies were probably written 6-7 years before they were published. With this symphony, we are able to date it a little bit more specifically because it's very clearly based on an E minor symphony by Haydn. So again, as I was saying earlier, the shadow of Haydn is cast over tonight, even in the absence of his own music. Haydn wrote his own E minor symphony, number 44, the Trauer. So-called Trauer means funeral, and it's reported, not entirely reliably, that Haydn wanted the slow movement of that symphony to be performed at his funeral, which is why it has the nickname the Trauer, the funeral symphony. The similarities between Haydn's symphony and Zimmermann's symphony are sufficiently clear, I think, for it to be evident that Zimmermann had Haydn's piece as a model. And we know that the Haydn dates from, well, again, it's a bit approximate, but probably 1771. So that makes it likely that this symphony was written sometime between 1772 and 1774. It's a rather remarkable piece. I actually only came across it. It's not, tonight we have 4 UK premieres, of which this is one. But I can't claim any of the credit for discovering Zimmermann. About 5 years ago, a single CD came out of 3 or 4 of his symphonies. And I read a review in Gramophone and thought it sounded interesting, and went out and bought it, and was really bowled over by the quality of the music. I've been asking the players what they think of it, and they generally like it, but they did say that when we started rehearsing the Mozart, they breathed a little bit more deeply and felt more in their element. It's the similarities with Haydn. Firstly, obviously, in a way, it has the Viennese-style 4 movements. A lot of early Italianate symphonies had 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. The so-called Viennese symphony had 4 movements, of which the third was a minuet and trio. And Haydn's E minor symphony has a minuet and trio that is basically a canon between quite a stark canon without any harmony. It's basically the violins play a melody, and then the lower strings, viola, cello, bass, play the same melody a bar later. And it sort of superimposes like Verajaka or something. And Haydn did this, and Zimmermann does exactly the same. Similarly, Haydn's symphony begins with a very strong, almost fierce unison figure, so no harmony, just everybody playing the same notes. Zimmermann's symphony begins exactly the same. The only difference is the 4th movement, and I don't want to give the game away because it is a spectacularly unusual end to a symphony. But I wonder whether it was a nod in the direction of Haydn's next symphony in the numbering system, The Farewell, which famously ends with only 2 players left on stage as all the other players have processed off. I'll be interested to hear your collective opinions of Zimmermann after tonight's performance. So the other new composer is Pasquale Anfossi. He was a native Italian. He was born on the northwest coast, just northwest of Genoa, in 1727, so nearly 30 years older than Mozart. He didn't write a successful opera. I've just realised, actually, I've been talking rubbish. Anfossi is the one who started late, not Zimmermann. Anfossi wrote his first opera in 1773, So he would have been, mid-40s. And it was written in Rome, and the following January, when you think in the mid-40s, Mozart had already been dead for a decade, and Fosse wrote his first successful opera. On the strength of that, he went on to write another 50 operas. And it does rather beg the question, if Mozart had lived to 80, 85, 90, like some of these composers did, what the history of what we have of his music, how different would that have been? So at the beginning of 1774, our year in question, Fosse wrote his second successful opera, again in Rome, and it was called La Finta Giardiniera. Now, the significance of that is that the same year, a few months later, Mozart was commissioned to write an opera for Munich, and he decided to set exactly the same libretto, La Finta Giardiniera. He very probably didn't know Fosse's music at all, but the libretto was in fact, Fosse's opera was very successful. It was performed here in London. It was performed as far afield as Lisbon, Dresden, really quite often revived across Europe. One of the advantages I confess I have in putting these programs together, a piece like the Fosse, all I need to do, my task, is to find 3 or 4 minutes of music. So I'm not suggesting that Fosse's opera is demanding of revival. But the charming little aria that we're performing for you tonight is typical of where the operatic language of the time was. It's about a sort of comic, as Haydn operas were beginning to do at the time. The distinction between serious operas and comic operas was beginning to be fudged. So some of the comic operas had serious characters in, often aristocrats, and I guess that developed towards The Count and The Marriage of Figaro. And this aria is sung by an aristocrat who's trying to woo somebody who's really not interested. So it starts off as a charming serenade, and then very clearly from the music and the libretto, but there's no stage direction in the actual score, but luckily there is in the libretto. She clearly pulls a face as if to sort of push him away, so he suddenly gets all stroppy. And then there's this incredible sort of stage direction that he says, okay, I will go because I can tell you want me to go. But in parting, can I have a farewell kiss? Which is very bold of him. And as he's singing this, she actually walks away, and a male onlooker, unsuspecting, comes across. So, of course, in true comic opera style, he turns around and kisses the guy, realizes what he's done. Not only is it the guy, he's the mayor of the town. So he suddenly has to be very obsequious to this mayor. So it's a very tiny little comic set piece, but it's absolutely typical when we're assessing Mozart operas. Not that we need to assess it, but what the enjoyment that we get out of them by seeing what the sort of standard operas of the time are. And to be honest, in purely musical terms, I think the melody of Fosse's aria bears comparison with Mozart's. It's all the other stuff that Mozart did that set him apart. Apart from Mozart, the other main composer that we're featuring tonight is Gluck, who had a very interesting and patchy career. He's now sort of known as the composer of Orpheus and Eurydice, and then increasingly, a few of his other works are becoming acknowledged. He'd written many operas by 1762 when the Orfeo was written. And the Orfeo was a big success. It was, many of you will already know about this, I suspect. It was a so-called reform opera that Gluck combined with a librettist called Calzabigi, and they decided they wanted to change opera. They decided that opera was old-fashioned and in danger of getting boring and stuck in a rut. So they wanted to challenge all the things they disliked and make it more modern, more realistic, less repetition, less divided into aria and recitative and another aria, and just trying to break the restrictions that they felt was imposed by the sort of Handelian, I guess, opera's area. So Gluck wrote 3 so-called reform operas, the Orfeo in 1762, Alceste, Italian version, in 1767, and Paride et Helena, Paris and Helen, the Trojan War, in 1770. After 1770, he seems to have decided that he'd had enough of Vienna, where he'd been for a couple of decades. He'd had quite a bit of time in Vienna before Orfeo, including writing some French operas for Vienna. But he decided that he wanted Paris to be where he continued his career. And in a way, that's not surprising, because the French influence on his reform operas was quite strong. But French opera was grand, epic, and actually a lot of Gluck's operas weren't. But he decided that conquering Paris was what he should do. And at around the same time, 1771, 72, someone gave him a French translation of a libretto of Iphigénie on Aulide, and he decided that he was going to set it, this French opera, with no commission, no guarantee of having this opera performed. And that's maybe not totally uncommon nowadays, but in those days it was unheard of to write an opera without knowing at the beginning of the process that you had a contract to be paid to write the opera. And he wrote this opera, and there's a wonderful thing, in fact it must have been 1771, because in 1772 he claimed that he'd finished writing the opera, but there was one problem in that he hadn't written any of it down. It was all in his head, but he reckoned he'd written all of it. He went to Paris. He had the advantage of having previously taught as the daughter of the Empress in Vienna, the lady who was now, as of 1770, Marie Antoinette. And she put in a good word, and eventually Gluck received, in one fell swoop, a contract to write 7 operas for Paris, which was obviously very bold, and I think the Parisians were quite thrown that this invading guy from Austria, of Bavarian descent, was suddenly the senior figure in French opera. And not only had he written this Iphigénie opera without a commission, he rehearsed it for months on end. He sort of got singers together and they just rehearsed. It's rather wonderful to think. And eventually it was performed. It was generally considered a success, but within a few weeks, Louis XV died. Therefore, all the theatres had to close, so the opera closed. So it wasn't quite the calling card that he'd hoped for. So it was time to turn to his second opera for Paris, and he decided one of the issues he also had was that he was finding that he wasn't as creative as he had been in his youth. So it was actually, he was finding it quite hard to come up with new ideas, having written so many operas already. He'd already written, 40 or so operas. So he decided to go back and create, and he ended up creating French versions of several of his operas. But the second opera that he wrote for Paris, as really to cement his reputation there, he decided to turn back to the opera that had been most successful for him, the Orfeo and Eurydice. So he wrote a French version, but because it was written for Paris, he needed to adapt it to Parisian style and Parisian taste, which generally meant more ballet, more chorus, a full evening's entertainment, whereas the original opera was slightly under 80 minutes. So he wrote this full version. The other big change, he'd originally written Orfeo in 1762 for Guardani, famous castrato. In 1769, he did a revised version, still in Italian, in Parma, for another castrato in the title role, but a castrato with a higher voice. So he'd modified the whole role to be just a little bit higher, and to sort of crudely reduce it. The original version nowadays is an ideal fit for a countertenor, whereas the 1769 version is an ideal fit for a mezzo-soprano. In Paris, they didn't like castrati. They were Italian creations, and they didn't want to go anywhere near them. So Gluck had to do something different. So he decided to recast the title role as a tenor, as a high tenor. And that involved all sorts of adapting. He also had to generally sort of spruce it up a bit. So he wrote a very difficult, impressive, showy aria for Orfeo that's not in the original version at the end of Act 1, added an aria for Eurydice. Just basically added more music for pretty much everybody. The scene, the climactic scene in Act 3 that we're performing tonight was the least changed. So a lot of the music is the same as in the original version, but modified into different keys, modified for a tenor, and again, slightly extended, but sort of using the same music. And it's actually been a real sort of detective process. Although it's roughly the same, there are loads of tiny little differences between the two versions. So, the same bit of music marked to be played at a different speed or slightly different orchestration, or a change of speed within the music is in a slightly different place. And it's very hard to know nowadays, without any information other than the two scores that we have, whether that second version represented a load of small changes that Gluck decided to make as a conscious change to improve it or to make it more French, or whether the differences signify what he probably meant all along, and whether, of course, in the Italian version he meant that to be the same. And one of the complications or things that we need to bear in mind now is that in the 18th century, nearly always, the opera was musically rehearsed, prepared, including the orchestra, and conducted, although they didn't have conductors in the modern sense of the word, by the composer. And similarly, the librettist did the stage direction. So when a composer was writing down his score, he knew that he was going to be on hand throughout rehearsals to be able to explain and work with the singers. So he didn't necessarily need to be as precise and specific in what he wrote in the score as composers nowadays need to be. So the difference of sort of information between a Gluck opera and a Puccini opera or a Verdi opera is massive. But it has been very interesting, and a lot of the things that we're doing tonight are just sort of instinctive decisions based on, we quite often in rehearsal we tried both versions and sort of pieced together. If we did it again in a year's time, I may make a completely different set of decisions, who knows. The main difference at the culmination, so when Orfeo has tried to lead Eurydice out of the underworld, had a moment of weakness, feels sorry for her because she's whinging like crazy, saying, "Why aren't you looking at me? You don't love me anymore." So he turns around to look at her, thereby breaking the condition of the permission from the gods that he can bring her back to life and out of Hades. So she dies a second death, and because a happy ending in an opera in the 1760s, as it originally was mandatory, Cupid has to appear again and restore her to life, so for a third lot of life. And in the original score, that happens purely in orchestrally accompanied, but just in recitative. So there isn't a number, there isn't a tune, it just happens sort of as dialogue. And in the Paris version, Mozart Haydn, Gluck's the name I'm thinking. Gluck added a trio for all three characters so they can express their joy together at this happy ending. And he lifted this trio, the first half of the trio, from the third of his reform operas, Paride ed Elena from 1770. Same key, same music, actually same dramatic situation. We have a united couple at the end of an opera and Cupid flitting around saying, "Aren't I wonderful? It's great being me." And at the end of that trio, Gluck takes us into new music to lead us into E major from E minor, so that we're in a sort of fully happy ending. So that's quite a big scene. It feels massive because a lot of music happens, but it's actually less than 20 minutes. But it feels like the nucleus of the opera. That constitutes the second half of the concert, so the fourth quarter. The first half and the second half is taken up by Mozart's Symphony No. 29. And I think I put something in the program. It suddenly crossed my mind a couple of weeks ago when I was turning my mind to writing the program notes. Is there a greater piece of music written by a teenager? I'm not sure that there is. There are a few contenders from Mozart himself, but for me, this music is an incredible leap into total mastery, total maturity. And my wife, rather curiously, about a week ago, sent me, she sent me a link, or maybe I looked it up, but she said, did you know that Einstein was absolutely crazy about Mozart, and whenever he was working, he would listen to Mozart? And I hadn't known this, so I Googled Einstein and Mozart. And what came up was, the first thing that came up was an article on the website of, I think it was from King's College London, quite a short article, talking about Einstein's love of music and his attitude towards music and his attitude towards Mozart. And what Einstein said, and he linked this to his own work, he said, Beethoven created music. He sort of decided what he wanted to do, he chiseled away, and he created music. Mozart, according to Einstein, found music that was already there. He was the one that was clever enough to notice it. And Einstein's argument was that his theory of relativity was not a discovery, it was something that had always been there, but he was smart enough to identify it and recognize it. And he felt that Mozart did exactly the same. And if we're to think of, and that really resonates with me, because I remember very clearly as a student, the first time I worked in rehearsal on a production of The Marriage of Figaro, I had this sort of spooky feeling that I already knew it, and it just felt like this music had always been there. So I'm very fond of this newly discovered Einstein theory, another Einstein theory. And if I wanted to choose a piece of music to express what it is about Mozart's music, I might well choose the beginning of this symphony, actually, the Symphony No. 29, because it just feels like spring water. It's just there. It feels like it's always been there, and it's so incredibly open-hearted, inevitable, but surprising at one and the same time. It's an amazing piece. It's 4 movements, all very different. The second movement is sublime melody, very noble, quite operatic in terms of, it reminds me quite a bit of the Countess in The Marriage of Figaro. A very impish minuet and the most flamboyant finale. So I think it's one of, probably, we're now finally just short. Well, he wrote that in April, he finished that in April, so he was 18 by the time he composed the Symphony No. 29. And I would say as an 18-year-old already, he's writing something that is a contender for Desert Island Disc Mozart. I haven't had time to mention 2 other composers, Salieri. This feels like an Oscar speech suddenly. Thank you, Salieri. Thank you, Slivacek. Both of whom were performing arias by both that have never been performed in this country before. Both, I think, very refined, beautiful, and well written. So this is our selection, what we've chiseled away at and come up with as our representation of 1774. I very much hope you enjoy the concert, and thank you so much for coming.